again, for those who just joined, thanks so much for joining our webinar today on mobility devices and the fire safety issues relating to that. Big thank you to Andy Frankum, who's agreed to join us today and share some of his knowledge and experience. Really appreciate that. Thank you, Andy. And many of you will know Andy already, I've no doubt. So looking today at mobility devices and fire safety issues relating to that. I'm sure you all know who we are, metroSTOR, external storage to reduce fire risk, safer homes, safer neighbourhoods, cleaner world, bin stores, bike stores and scooter stores, and the fire risks, the sort of things that we can help you as landlords address. Looking first, mainly at powered mobility, as we call it now, because it's not just the mobility scooters, it's the sort of emerging issues around e-bikes and e-scooters and anything powered with lithium-ion batteries that we weren't perhaps aware of before. The first being the lithium-ion aspect, and then the second that is now applying to a lot more devices, not just the mobility scooters used by older people, disabled people, people with reduced mobility, but there's all sorts of people looking at alternative forms of travel, maybe sometimes even instead of using a car. So I wanted to I'll kick off with a few things around the lithium-ion aspect, and then we'll go pretty quickly across to Andy, who will cover the areas around the legislation, the guidance, the procedures, and the things that we should be, the sorts of things that we should be adopting in terms of process and competence and so forth. And then a bit more at the end about the solutions that you could employ if an external location is the preferred option. So lithium-ion batteries, first of all, why are they such a fire risk? Now, of course, they're used in everything from mobile phones, even vapes, through laptops, etc., and through to an increasing number of mobility scooters and other forms of mobility. So lithium-ion batteries. Now, they're being used so extensively because they're very powerful in a very small package, so small size, small weight, and there is an issue obviously surrounding them, in that there's an inherent flammability because of the electrolyte. The electrolyte's flammable, and a vulnerability to overheating. When that occurs, there's a large release of gases which are toxic. There's a high likelihood of that igniting, and a fire that's been described as ferocious that develops off the back of that. And that's something known as thermal runaway. What are the causes for that? Well, it can be manufacturing defects. They're really many of them. They're not very well controlled in terms of the products that are released to market. If they're not manufactured within a very controlled environment, then there can be impurities there which can lead to a fire. Design defects on the actual product. If the manufacturer tries to reduce weight, for example, to or reduce cost, then potentially the batteries may not be protected sufficiently. Misuse is often an issue. They're stored perhaps near a heat source. People try and repair them, perhaps themselves. And something which we've seen a lot is where people have perhaps replaced a battery with a poor quality battery. Sometimes even second life batteries are actually put onto the market using a non-genuine, for want of a better expression, charger, for example, increases the risk of overcharging, overheating, and then obviously the battery going into this thermal runaway. Now, quite a few of those things can occur quite easily. A number of the incidents recently have actually been people effectively making their own e-bikes, buying various components and putting them together, and them not being compatible. So what actually happens in that thermal runaway event? As I said, there's release of gases. It can look like steam or white smoke, but it is toxic. If you see something like that happen, you want to get out there pretty fast. It's not always followed by an ignition, but in most cases it is. And it is pretty much an explosion. It's a huge release of energy. It will, blow the windows out of a property, and you can get a very hot, a very rapidly developing fire, depending on the amount of combustibles, etc., that are in the vicinity. To actually extinguish that is a real challenge. In confined spaces, you'll be needing breathing apparatus. Even electric cars, they generally deal with via immersion, literally put it in a skip full of water. But huge volumes of water are often used to extinguish lithium-ion battery fire. And then you've got the issues around runoff from that as well. So many of the people I speak to, they say, oh, yes, we've had an incident already. Others say, well, why haven't we heard about this? Well, there has been a sharp increase in recent months. And sadly, we'd have our first fatality linked to an e-bike fire in Bristol just the other week. The London Fire Brigade attended over 100 incidents last year, and that's increasing. I saw some data from the New York Fire Department where they had more than one a day in the last month. So this is rapidly becoming an issue. So with that, we're over to Andy. Andy, really look forward to hearing your experience and knowledge on this subject. Most would know Andy co-authored the guidance from the National Fire Chiefs Council, and the wealth of knowledge on the subject. Thank you, Andy.
Thanks, Nigel. Thanks for that intro. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. Really interesting view there around lithium-ion. It seems to be a big problem. So I'm assuming that's why you're all here today, to understand about what we can do about that. So just before I kick off, I just wanted to briefly mention about the National Social Housing Fire Strategy Group. I chair that organisation. It's a voluntary membership group made up of fire safety professionals across England and Wales. And as Nigel said, that I co-wrote I have to say, whilst I co-wrote it, I had lots of help from lots of other housing organisations as well to produce the NFCC mobility scooter guidance in residential buildings. And that was produced back in 2018. There was lots of discussion going on across organisations at that time about, how do we manage the risk from mobility scooters? Because lots of fire and rescue services were going into blocks and finding them on escape routes, and so were fire risk assessors, and no one really knew what to do or how to sort of manage that. In some cases that be an individual situation because the resident may need that for medical purposes. In other cases, they might just want to use it because they want to. Yes, definitely an issue back then, and as we've seen recently with e-bikes, e-scooters, etc., there's lots of issues around that too. So can you just move on to the next slide, Nigel, please? Okay, so all in all, lots of risks for landlords, and I say for landlords, but for residents too, and we obviously want to make sure that residents are safe in the blocks that we manage, and there's lots of new hazards being introduced into blocks. We've seen the sort of this rapid rise around e-scooters and e-bikes with no regulation around this, and I go back 5 years and mobility scooters was in exactly the same place. There was no regulation around it, but the consistent point of this is that back then mobility scooters didn't necessarily have lithium-ion batteries. They may have had other types of batteries, and therefore, whilst there was a risk, if that happened, then you talk, as Nigel mentioned, fires in excess of between 600 to 900 degrees, which is effectively the equivalent of having a fully fueled car in your bedroom set alight with a full tank of fuel. That's how powerful these things can chuck out in terms of the energy when they're on fire. So at one end of the scale, very, very dangerous if it happens. But recognizing that people are using these new products. Clearly, there's a lot of education around this. I mean, I think that needs to be had. It was the same when we wrote the guidance for mobility scooters, and I refer to, whilst the guidance, the NFCC guidance is specific to mobility powered devices such as mobility scooters and powered wheelchairs. Back then, that's what the guidance was, and I don't know if NFCC have got plans to review that, but clearly, as we see the new Fire England regulations coming into play in January, I expect that the Home Office will be producing a number of sets of guidelines around different fire hazards, and so we'll see where that explores. But I think the principles of the guidance that we put out for mobility scooters could very well be applied to e-scooters and e-bikes, etc. So there are some differences. I don't know if many people know this, but there are a couple of links on the Gov website. I'll post them in the chat in a minute, but there's one around electric bikes, which basically talks about what's called an EAPC, which is an electrically assisted pedal cycle. Now, if the bike has got pedals and it's electrically assisted, then it's entirely legal. You can ride these things if you're over 14 years of age. They're effectively treated like an ordinary cycle. No registration. You don't need a license for them. You don't need insurance for them. But they have to meet certain criteria, such as they can't travel more than 15.5 miles per hour. They've got maximum output of 250 watts. And if that criteria is met, that's classed as an EAPC. Normally, we'd have some sort of plate on the equipment on the bike, which would explain those things, and would normally be type approved, which again will be a manufacturer plate on the bike. So if those things are met, EAPCs are absolutely completely legal. That doesn't detract from lithium-ion battery risk. It's just like with anything else. We've got laptops and mobile phones, and lots of different devices have these batteries in. And if you treat them with respect and look after them, and use the approved chargers, for example, lithium-ion can do a brilliant job in terms of powering equipment. But if they're not looked after, or they're not to standard, or inferior chargers are being used, then that's when thermal runaway comes into play, where things will start to overheat and overcharge, and eventually the inside of the battery breaks down, and then that causes that release of energy and the explosion, etc. So that's what these issues are at the moment. A lot of the incidents that we've seen are from equipment that are not regulated, that are not to current British or European standards, and that have found their way into the market, like mobility scooters did, 5-6 years ago, and it's an issue. And when that happens, I don't know how many of you have, I've got a car, it's got a charger in it. I put my phone on it, put my iPhone on it, and after a while it gets really hot. And that's because it's not the correct charger for the phone, even though it'll charge it. And I have to take it off because it get, so, I think it's, that's just one area. In terms of e-scooters are different. So again, there's separate guidance on this on the Gov website that refers to e-scooters as powered transporters. Now, powered transporters include things like hoverboards, e-scooters, segways, etc. And they are against the law. If you're not riding these on private ground, you have to have permission from the person that you're using them on. So I would argue that if residents are bringing e-scooters into blocks, then they should ask for permission to store them in those blocks. So we'll come on to permission in a bit, but I think they're effectively treated like any other motor vehicle under the Road Traffic Act 1988, which is defined as a mechanically propelled vehicle intended or adapted for use on roads. And a lot of these e-scooters are put together, a bit like mobility scooters. Mobility scooters, I think, when we did the research for the guidance, there was only one country in the world that was manufacturing mobility scooters in its full way, and that was Germany. Everywhere else where mobility scooters were being produced and sold were basically imported in and then skinned down to the bare bones, and then upholstery and other batteries and the wiring was all added to it before it was then sold on. But with e-scooters, it's effectively a criminal offence to use them, as we know. We know this is not regulated or enforced in any way, but basically the sellers and the users can be subject to, will create a criminal offence and can be prosecuted for doing so. And there is a requirement on sellers to provide adequate information on the use of e-scooters in the correct format. There are also some trials going on, and we know that, for example, London Underground have banned use of anyone bringing in e-scooters on the Underground, but they are looking at a scheme where they're checking, bringing their own units in that could be used. So, lots of challenging issues here. There is some case law as well. So I'm going to drop these links on the chat for everyone. So the first one is around powered transporters, and the second one is around e-bikes. So, there are some rules around this. terms of learning lessons, you know, I think in my operational days, I spent a good length of time going into blocks, talking to residents, trying to find solutions for storage. And the key thing that I found was actually having a really good conversation with the resident, you know, trying to understand what their needs were, whether there was any alternative areas where scooters could be stored and things like that. So, you know, I think we can certainly understand these type of incidents when they happen, try and understand the details around that. But regulation's not there, but there's definitely some guidance out there that can help you dealing with this type of risk. Next slide, please. So what are the aims? Yeah, the aim is ultimately we need to reassure residents that safety for them and others in a block is priority. You know, so you know there's lots of issues here. Yes, if these things explode, they are going to cause some damage. They could impede the escape routes, and that could stop people from getting out when they need to. So lots of considerations around this. I've heard the word, oh, you know, shall we ban these things? You know, like with any new equipment, I think when they're causing these types of fires, you know, that's the automatic sort of view really. But I think they're not going to be banned. You know, government are actively doing trials on this equipment, which may bring in some further regulation. And they are looking at this to, you know, because the help people to get around. And electric is, you know, it's up and coming, isn't it? You know, we're seeing the move with electric vehicles, you know, and in terms of the aims of net zero and the challenges around the environment. So lots of competing challenges with this too. But ultimately, you know, we want providers to make sure that they're complying with legislation and best practice. Next slide. As I said before, I think the key with residents is it's easy to look at a block and go, you've got 5 scooters in there or 5 e-scooters. You know, if you don't know that they're there, then you know you can't give that information to fire and rescue. So if there is a fire in your block, how are they going to know? You know, it's just like any other hazards. You know, with oxygen tanks, for example. You know, we identify those, especially in more supported housing led accommodation, you know, to give that information to the fire and rescue service. If we don't know e-scooters are in the blocks or mobility scooters, how can we give them that information? Because, you know, they may pose a fire risk. But the key with residents is really just to talk to them and just have that open conversation with them, listen to understand why they're using that equipment, and escalate any issues. There will be a solution. There are various different ways of doing that. Some of these solutions may cost money, you know, and not every option is the right option. So there are a number of examples which I'll talk about in a minute, but you'll see that it will be different for every case. So you have to think about it in those terms. Next slide. So these are just some of the questions to ask, really, in terms of, you know, when you're doing that assessment of, you know, is your block affected? Have we got e-scooters, mobility scooters, powered wheelchairs, and the like in there? These are the sort of questions that you should be asking. You know, can it be stored in a room that's got a fire door on it with a detector in the room? You know, are people charging it at night? You know, which increases the sleeping risk. Is there a way of preventing that? Have you got an area in the building that you could use as a storage area that you could put those controls in? You know, do you know, one, how many have you got in your building already? But two, what are you going to do for when new residents move in? What information are you giving to them to make sure that you're setting expectations right at the beginning? And if you don't know what that capacity is or how many you've got in the building, then you're going to struggle to deal with it. So, but it's about being, reasonable and proportionate on this. It's about education. It's about giving residents some information. It's also about, you'll need that information, for the fire risk assessment, because how can you make sure it's suitable and sufficient if you know that the scooters and you haven't got a process to try and manage that. So they're just some of the questions. Hopefully, I'm not going to go through all of them, but hopefully that just gives you a flavour on the slides as to the sort of things that you could ask. Next slide, please. So, when we wrote the guidance, and this was written around mobility scooters, but I do think some of this still applies to e-scooters and the like. First and foremost, you need to have a policy, organisational policy around what you're going to do, whether that be local rules or whether that be, an organisational policy on this. You need to have something that sets out expectations, and then it's sharing that information with residents. You need to be able to identify what the capacity you have at each block. I'm talking about blocks here because that's where we've got multiple residents in one place, and that's where the risk is. We have seen, and we've seen this with incidents where, individual houses, scooters outside the front door being charged, caught fire, and some residents passed away as a result of that. But so it's thinking about giving residents the right information. And blocks, that's about, in terms of new residents, then you can put a process in around the need to seek permission to do so. But what do you do with the existing residents unless you have a program of identifying that? And then how do you maintain that? So do you need a register? Question mark. Engage with residents collectively. There was many a time where we did like sort of resident meetings, in the lounge of the building. We just got all the residents together and just explained to them why we need to keep the escape routes clear. And in some cases we get local fire and rescue down with us to help us with that, just to explain what the risks are. But we would never get into individual conversations in those forums, but we would pick that up with the individual residents separately and have a conversation, because there will be personal reasons why they may have a scooter. So solutions have got to be person-centered. It's all about having the dialogue with the resident. You can't just apply a standard approach to this. Where you have got scooters in buildings, it needs to be person-centered. There needs to be a risk assessment approach to this, and it needs to be pragmatic. Staff need to be trained, so whatever procedures you put in place, staff need to be aware. So we've got housing officers going out. They need to be able to know what to do if they spot something like this, because it's about making sure that we can keep those escape routes clear and safe for everyone. And then some sort of reporting system for residents that, that might be customer services. You might have a different process for that, but, there needs to be a mechanism where if there's a problem, residents should be able to call in and be able to report an issue. If someone's been driving a mobility scooter and, crashed into the wall and it's a fire rated wall, or there's damage to the lift in some way, so there's lots of things you need to think about in terms of reporting. Next slide. So what are the options? So a lot of these options you will note are in the NFCC guide, but also are we're covered in the purpose-built block of flats guidance around mobility scooters, and these are just all of the different options. I think the risks are increasing around lithium-ion, primarily because products are getting into the marketplace that are not fit for purpose. So we need to be able to identify what they look like. And so, internal storage in residence flats, the last thing we want to do is tell them to put it in the flat and then they stick it in the hallway, effectively block themselves in. So if there is a fire, they've got no way of escaping. So, we need to be mindful of that control. But, we could be repurposing internal storage rooms. Maybe you've got some new builds that you're trying to think about how you can design that in the longer term, and have some of those, especially for over 55 schemes. But you may also want to think about external storage, because that might be the best solution, because the building doesn't offer any suitable alternatives. And Nigel's going to touch on the external stuff shortly. Next slide. There we go. So I'm just going to hand back to Nigel, and then we'll pick up Q&A afterwards. Thanks, everyone.
Really helpful, Andy. Thank you. Really appreciate your insights there. So, so Dan's been saying that there's a number of solutions that could be implemented, and if, as you follow through this process, you decide that an external storage facility is something that you want to consider, there's a few things that we need to think about. Clearly, there need to be, there's criteria that they need to be meeting, so that the risk is addressed properly. We've broken that down into a few different steps. Looking firstly at the capacity, and he's touched on it already, really, but how many scooters might be in use already. But I think also there's an element of future proofing, having those conversations, who actually would really like one of these if, as a safe, secure method of storage was provided. I don't think there's really any rule of thumb as to how many units would be provided for, say, a sheltered scheme of 30 flats. It seems to vary quite a lot on location. If the building's already if it's quite well served with local shops and facilities, and there's a bus stop right outside, then you probably find that not many of the residents actually want a mobility scooter. But it can actually make a difference for those less accessible buildings, where a mobility scooter actually makes them a viable, proposition for people with limited mobility. The second is making sure that the storage that we provide is actually accessible for users. Clearly, there's almost always going to be an element of impaired mobility. That's why they've bought it. And we've explored all the internal options and decided that we need to use an external one. But if they can't get to it, or can't get to it easily enough, then of course they're not going to use it. They're still going to be putting them in the flat or in a common area, which clearly is not acceptable. So we're trying to find a space which is as close to the building as possible without compromising, the fire safety aspect. And sometimes having smaller lockers, can be a way of actually achieving that. Making sure that they're served with appropriate paths, ramps, handrails, etc. And one thing we've done successfully in some instances is putting a unit which is large enough for the resident to drive in with a powered chair, for example, next to the scooter, and transfer to the scooter for longer journeys. So that can be a way of overcoming that sort of distance challenge, mitigating it somewhat. So as we were saying about the fire safety aspect, we've moved the risk outside, but if we're not careful, it could still be a risk of fire spreading back into the dwelling. And there's elements there in the NFCC guidance about getting them 6 meters away, having appropriate level of fire resistance, and as a side note, from our point of view, we're actually doing product testing. We've done it on bin stores, and we'll be soon doing this on charging stations, including actual thermal runaway events. So we'll certainly keep you posted on that as we go. Also important that you make them really easy to use. Often the users may also struggle with locks and padlocks, heavy doors, and all that sort of thing. So really important that it's well lit and easy to access. Also really important that it's sufficiently secure. Quite a number of these items will be high value items, and we apply the same rationale as you do for cycle storage. Most or many storage systems are tested under the sold secure or secured by design sort of criteria. If you go for a cycle gold or cabinet silver, you know that you're achieving a reasonably high level of protection. Also putting them in a position where they can be seen by residents, not sort of tucked away out of sight, also helps from a security aspect. Often the users, the insurers will want to see that and be satisfied with that. And there's obviously additional protection that you can provide as well. There's products of all different shapes and sizes, basically, for different sizes of scooter and quantities, and increasingly now provision for e-bikes and e-scooters. The same principles apply, really. They've got to be durable, got to be secure, they've got to be weatherproof, got to be easily accessible. There's going to be the option for adding fire suppression to them as well. If they're very close to a building, you want to make doubly sure that any fire there is contained. So that's really it from me. We have got a Q&A sheet. I think probably the best plan is if I'll knock these slides off, and this is your opportunity to get as many questions across to Andy as you like. And I know I'll kick off with one that we had a bit further up in the chat about just a question about the sort of legal obligations, Andy, for disabled residents and how we should sort of approach that. Have you got any views on that at all?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, obviously I don't have the answers for everything, but I will do my best. Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of there is legislation for disabled residents. It's called the Equality Act, and sometimes that, as we know, will conflict with fire safety regulations from occasion to occasion. But I think it comes back to forget what the legislation says. It's about we're trying to keep people safe in a building, and we really need to have that conversation with the resident. And if they do have a disability, we have to be mindful of that, which is why I said it's got to be person-centered. External stores are great, but if people can't get from the store to the flat, then there's a problem, isn't there? So, which is why I say that that won't be the right solution all of the time. So you have to think about these things when you're doing the assessment. So, I'm sure most of you do person-centered fire risk assessments, I hope. And it could be that you're building that into that process, so that we're picking up this proactively to do that. But yes, of course, we've got to consider disabled residents, but it's about trying to keep everyone safe, including the resident in question. So hope that helps in some way. But I hope government are obviously consulting on this, aren't they, around PEEPs and things like that. So hopefully they listen to what people are saying and think about what they want to do next, really, in that space.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Andy. Well, I've got a question from Glenn. Come in, Glenn.
Nigel, I've worked with you for many years now, and you know that. One of the biggest obstacles we have is the need for planning permission. There is no permitted development rights in flats. So when we come to install one of your units, we need planning permission for it, which is an obstacle and delays things. Do you know if there's any movement in the planning teams to look at the permitted development rights of flats and maybe allow mobility scooters, particularly in retirement living schemes? Or would you not think we'll ever progress that?
I've not heard Andy.
No, I haven't. I mean, I think like with Anthony, if you make changes, say if you got a room and you're adapting it for scooter storage, then we obviously has to get the right sign-offs. But I haven't heard nothing around whether they're going to relax any of that. Except for, so if you're changing the electrical installation, you'd obviously need to get Part P sign off and so on. And so, yeah, no, sorry, Glenn, I can't help on that one, I'm afraid.
Okay, thank
you. Please feel free, guys, to come with any other questions. Stick your hand up. I think I saw one just now about use of sort of fire blankets and that sort of thing. If they do have to be stored somewhere in a flat, have you got any views on sort of the measures that could be employed, Andy?
Yeah, no, I saw the comment from Claire on this one. I mean, I do know that these things exist. I know Envirograph do one, and I'm sure there are other makes available. It's like with anything, you got a fire hazard. If it catches fire, you want to contain it. And we all sort of know what the basic rules are around being able to put a fire out. So I think any barrier that's around a scooter will help. But I think I did have some concerns when these came out, just in terms of, one, it's not necessarily going to hold the smoke in, and two, how is the resident going to get out off the scooter when they're inside of it? Amongst other things. But it's like with anything, the right control measure. If you do that assessment and it works for you, then I think I wouldn't knock anything in terms of that. But in reality is, if one of these things does catch fire, a plastic sheet tied with some string or rope, whatever it is, isn't going to contain that fire. It will reduce the oxygen levels, but the energy and the kilowatt of the fire is just going to not last for long. All it's going to do is slow the time so that someone can deal with it, i.e. fire and rescue, by attending. So yeah, I think where we can, I would prefer to have scooters in, a room that's 30-minute fire rated, with fire doors on, with detection in play, with some sort of control around charging, especially at night. I think, it was always a difficult one, and then we got into other questions like, do we charge residents for the cost of electricity for charging? And that became very difficult, especially in mixed blocks where you've got part leaseholder, part rented. And, the organisation that I was working for at the time just took the view that we wouldn't charge residents for that because it didn't apply to everyone. But we did, walk around the building, practically walk around the building to see if there was any areas that we could adopt, for scooter storage, where there might already be an existing room with fire doors on it, with detection in it, etc. So not every building has that, and some buildings you probably will say, no, we can't allow any scooters. If it's a general needs block with a single staircase and an escape route that's 1 meter wide, then you've got doormats and everything else. Scooters are just not going to be in the right environment for that. So it's just weighing all of these things up, really, just to take a view and apply the guidance where you can. I mean, there were some cases we had some really difficult situations to deal with, where we had it right on the escape route and there was a medical need for that resident, and so we tried to work with the fire and rescue service to help us to try and come up with a solution. And in some cases it might have been, there was a dead end space on the end, off an escape route, where if we put some storage in and we put some compensatory measures in, then we could potentially look at that. But obviously those things would cost money. And there are, reasonably cheap options, but there are, so I think you just have to take that in the round, do that assessment and take a view, but it's got to be person centered, I'm afraid.
Yes, we have, Andy. And I'm grateful for a comment Ian's just put on the chat about just to underline that with the lithium-ion battery, this isn't just smoke; it's a toxic gas, and there are firefighting blankets and things to be used by firefighters. But I don't think we, as users, and we don't want to be anywhere near that. We want to be, clear of that space, pretty sharpish, shall we say?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Kirk, I think.
Sorry, Nigel. I was just going to say that. Sorry, go ahead.
Cheers, Andy. Thanks, Nigel. Yeah, I've got a resident. She actually sits on my resident engagement panel, and she's forever leaving her hubby's mobility scooter in the sort of means of escape outside of her flat. She lives in a 1-bedroom flat, and the area she leaves it is a huge area, which is a lift lobby. So where she puts it in a corner, nobody actually would fall over it if they were trying to leave that area. There's only 2 flats in that area. And what I suggested was she's got to keep in her flat and she'll not have it. So I said the next best solution then is to just disconnect the battery and have the battery disconnected for it. She only lives in a 1-bedroom flat, and he's one of the people who they couldn't walk to get to his scooter anywhere else. He needs to get out of the flat with it. So, but the flat's not big enough to have the scooter in. They're only on the 3rd floor, I believe. But that's the one. So what's your thoughts on that? Just leaving it where it is. It's not in anybody's way, but with the battery disconnected.
Yeah. Yes, Kate. I mean, I think that's absolutely fine because you're removing the ignition source effectively. So, as long as there isn't any other risk around arson, for example, people getting into the building, then, I think it's absolutely fine as long as it's not impeding the escape route. You just need to think about those things really in terms of the danger is, from a culture point of view, is that you allow one person to do it and then it soon spreads around the building. So when you're making these decisions about what your policy is in buildings, I would say, you need to consult with residents, but, and get their views on those things, but ultimately come up with that agreed approach to how you're going to manage scooters in those buildings.
Thank you.
Yes, very helpful, Andy. Do you think? I have come across situations where fires have occurred with batteries that are not being charged, they're just being stored. But we agree that the risk is lower, but it does still exist. And do you think, it's important that that's sort of included in that assessment?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, all I would say is that, I think came back to the question earlier around smoke and toxicity, and yes, it's an issue. Yes, we don't want people breathing that stuff in. Yes, we want to try and reduce the amount of time these incidents are, and providers can do so much. Residents can help with that if they're given the right information. And I think that's about education as well. It's about spotting the signs. So if the battery is overheating or the wiring's becoming frayed, are they using the right chargers? These are the sort of general things that we can give residents just to do that. And when we're doing walkabouts, we can check those things as well if they're in communal spaces. But yeah, I mean, I think there isn't a solution, one solution for this. The risk is still there, but I would argue as well, in the grand scheme of things, yes, there's an issue with lithium-ion, but there are other hazards in flats that we think about Grenfell. That was a white goods appliance that started. We don't put controls in around making sure that people are testing white goods when they go to a second-hand or a third-hand supplier to replace the fridge freezer, for example. People do overcharge laptops and batteries and go to bed and leave them on the pillar and all of those things. They leave them in sunlight, and given the right conditions, the right charger can be used. But if the temperature and the environment that battery is being charged in could cause overheating and resultant energy release. So there's lots of different ways, and I think Matt Humby did a good webinar on this. So anyone that from Centura, really explaining how lithium-ion batteries work, and I think that was last week. So you might be able to catch that on demand, hopefully. But yeah, it's definitely an issue. But I think we just need to think about this in the round as well. That yes, that it's high profile at the moment, and yes, there are products entering the market. But for me, I think it's the same issues as before. When inferior products come into the market, we need to educate residents and others. The government needs to deal with the product regulation coming in the first place. But we need to keep an eye on that too, and work together to try and find the best solution. Really.
Really helpful, Andy. Thank you. I saw we just got 2 or 3 minutes. I saw a question about appliances which do meet a certain standard, British standard, and that sort of thing. Do you think, Andy, that you can apply a different rationale or different process if they're marked, bearing in mind that some of this comes down to the things that may happen after the product was manufactured or during use? For example, in a sense, we've got to be very careful and very aware of what could happen in any situation. Would you say?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in terms of e-scooters, I think there's kits you can buy on eBay and loads of other stuff. So, there are other things that are going on out there where products are being amended and adapted, and not necessarily to the right standards. So, I think the key is that we try and identify what that looks like and share that widely so that we can spot those things. But it's not all bad. There are some really good, safe e-scooters and mobility scooters out there in the big wide world. So, but unfortunately, when these things happen, it's clearly devastating. Certainly, the Bristol incident was, clearly devastating for that family, and as a result of that. But I've seen other fires, e-cigarette explosions, for example, causing the same sort of level of damage. So I think we just need to be more aware of the type of hazards that are present in everyday living, and we need to try and adapt to those and try and identify and share and educate and put the right control measures in, really.
That's very helpful, Andy. Thank you for that. Well, there's lots of interesting points coming on the chat, which we're not going to be able to get to now, but I'm sure Andy, between Andy and myself, we'll try and respond to those after the session. So I'd encourage anybody to keep putting things on that chat, and Andy, if you're happy to put your email address, and I'll do the same, and some of those conversations no doubt can continue as we go forward.
Yes, definitely.
Really appreciate that. Big thank you to Andy for your contribution today. Really appreciate that, what you've shared. I'm sure everybody will echo that. Thanks so much, everybody. We'll look to make that information available, and please look out for future events as they come forward. Thank you so much. Thanks for joining. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.